Welcome to Order Militaris Radio TV, where lifelong Catholics will do is all for free and for the love of Jesus Christ and for our Holy Mother, the Church, and defend our Holy Mother, the Church. Today on episode 4, we'll hear how Jack gathered intelligence, was recruited for a short time to the OSS, and then a few other things that happened after that. Your brother Alexis Bonello.
Thank you, AJ, for having me on Order Militaris Radio TV. Talk about this great Catholic hero. And it turns out if he was never shot down, he would have never ended up in Vietnam. And we're going to follow the unusual trail that led his life in the direction it went. 2 months he was behind enemy lines, and he made it to England. And we just covered how his wife was absolutely delighted to hear he survived. So they treated him well, and he had to go through debriefing and.
Yeah. So Minneapolis newspapers announced that Jack returned to England a day after his telegram had arrived, but the stories revealed nothing of what he had experienced. Jack provided a hint in a letter to Bonnie a few days later, but he said only as much as he could get past military censors. I recall that last letter clearly, and I did exactly what I said I'd do the very next day, he wrote, referring to his promise to walk home if he were shot down. However, it took me some time to complete the deal. Much as I'd like to tell you what has happened, honey, I simply can't. Someday, however, you'll hear the whole story. He added happily, I have a darn good chance of eating my Christmas dinner with my own red-headed wife and the whole family. Are you happy? Well, I sure am. Darling, I promise to come back safe and sound, and I shall.
Now, would they first do? Who debriefed him? Was he debriefed by the OSS?
No, the United States Army Air Officer, Air Force officer, who knew him and confirmed by fingerprints at the Army's counterintelligence headquarters at a hotel in London. With that, he was authorized for debriefing.
Yeah, to make sure the same guy, not an imposter, come back.
Yeah. He and Raid Radar went through the same Army Air Force's interview process regarding their B-17 mission, its demise, and their subsequent evasion. Their separate interviews, written accounts were then compared when a single typewritten report was produced for use in training airmen for future missions. They explained what their plane had been in formation, whether their bombs had hit the target, the angles from which the German fighters had attacked, and the fate of their crewmates. Finally, they spun their own miraculous tales of evading capture. However, Rader's account differed on a number of details, since he had been in the dark about most of Jack's exploits as he roamed with the resistance members in Paris and on the northwest French coast.
And while his testimony, his experience caught the eyes of a lot of people, who did they have him talk to next?
So they have him talk to the OSS. So that would be at the end. Jack eagerly signed a form to safeguard information about the resistance, promising not to reveal how he had escaped or from what he had received help. You must be particularly on guard with members of the press, the form stated, a precedent warning for someone whose father was eager to share his son's adventures with Minnesotans.
Yeah. Okay, so for the audience that don't know, OSS was the U.S. military intelligence, an organization recently formed by Skull and Bone members who were already infiltrated the U.S. government as their way of controlling the progress of the war. Because, as we've reported on other programs here at Order Militaris Radio TV, the entire Second World War was organized by Skull and Bones, prepared, and even what factories were being bombed and what factories were not being bombed was being decided in the boardrooms of Skull and Bones banks in New York City. So the OSS was essential for them to maintain control of the army. But most people didn't know that. I mean, that's only recently come out. And so they were considered good guys back then. Jack would have seen them in that light.
So after completing his work with Americans, Jack was instructed to meet with the Free French officials about his time in France. His work with the resistance also caught the eye of the Office of Strategic Services officers at the Great Central Hotel in London. The OSS had been formed during the war over the concerns that the US government needed to coordinate priorities intelligence being run separately by various government agencies and branches of the military. So Jack's time in London wasn't all business. Thanks to the US Army booking him 2 nights at the elegant Cranston Waverly Hotel, he met up again with his old friend Bud Miller, who had lived down the street in Minneapolis. Bud had been in London for months and was able to provide all the sightseeing they could fit in. In his free time, Jack saw For Whom the Bell Tolls with Gary Cooper and Ingrid Bergman at the Carlton Theatre, in The Lisbon Story, at a musical at the London Hippodrome. While his aspirations for a career in music were long gone, he still had enough interest to attend a London Symphony Orchestra performance at the Royal Albert Hall that included the works by Wagner, Dostoevsky, and Beethoven.
That was a packed 3 day tour of London. You say that. I wonder how he tracked down his friend, you know. But I guess they had already shared data where they would be and stuff. So
Yeah.
I can imagine the Free French government was absolutely brimming with joy and pride to talk to Jack since he was half French, tell of his ordeal in France. They were probably quite impressed and quite happy to have that information. So, but you would think from this, Jack would go back flying into Europe on B-17s, but no. And why wasn't that the case?
So by the time he was back in the United States, the war was shifting to where it wasn't flying over France. And so they couldn't risk him with his knowledge of the resistance and everything to go back into the air, so they shipped him home.
Mhm.
So when he got home, he stayed with Bonnie at her parents' house when he returned to Minneapolis, which probably allowed them to catch up and on lost time better than if he had stayed at his parents' home. Ed and Georgette busily welcomed relatives and neighbors and visitors, including a woman whose son was in a German POW camp and wanted to talk to Jack. In addition, Ed saw career opportunities in the moment and helped arrange speaking engagements for his son. Jack was interviewed on December 7, 1943, on the local radio station WCCO as part of the special Pearl Harbor Day programming. While the Army would not allow him to provide many details of his escape, he made a point to salute the undying loyalty and unselfish sacrifice of the French people who were helping America. The French army has not been beaten, nor have the French people been whipped, he told the radio host. The Allies will find their old friends in the last war standing together with them in France again. And
Hmm.
Georgette listened proudly and said, Jack is more French than ever. She wrote to George, some people over there stuck their necks out for him, and we can thank them to have him back. He was one of the family, and they wanted him to stay with them and wait for the end of the war. Next
Mhm.
day, Jack gave a speech at his alma mater, John Marshall High School, then at the Honeywell Defense Plant. He also spoke at Southwest High, where his cousins Tom and Mary Ryan were in the audience for the War Heroes talk about bomber formations and German fighter attacks. After graduation, Tom would volunteer to become a pilot in U.S. Army Air Forces.
You know what's amazing about this? He's not in town 4 days and he already has like five speaking engagements.
Hmm.
And if if you had grandparents who lived in that age or parents, you know that America was a very different country than it is today. There was such an active social life. People got together at banquets, at balls, at dances, at dinners, and you just didn't sit home and watch the television. There was no television. And you didn't even sit home and listen to the radio. You went out, you visited friends, families, you ate together, uh, you went to theater, you went to movies. Um, of course, this didn't happen in small country towns, but in the cities, people were very social and they met a lot of people. And that's why they ended up getting married when they were 18, 19, 20, 22.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of confidence in American society. There was a lot of social activity. There wasn't all this isolation where, you sit in front of a computer screen, you play a video game for 4 months and no one sees you. That was just totally inhuman.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why Americans grow up today and they don't even know how to get married because they've never gone to any social activities. Even when I was growing up, I didn't grow up in the city, I grew up in the countryside. There were like no social activities. Society had already disintegrated.
Yeah.
And all the institutions that used to organize didn't organize these things anymore. And um, this has greatly damaged and weakened America. And it wasn't, in that generation, these problems hadn't yet broken out. And that's why what Jack experienced his first 4 days at home is something that no American veteran, not even maybe General Brass level, who comes home from war, experiences ever again.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, most, for example, American Legion posts, they're empty now. No one goes. They don't have any meetings. No one gets together. There's like nothing. No life, social life there at all. There are
Yeah.
no social organizations left in most towns. All
Mm-mm.
gone. So if you think that your cell phone is such a wonderful invention, realize it has destroyed your society because you don't meet another human person here. You're just talking to a device, you know.
Yeah.
So
So when Jack's leave finally came to an end, he was ordered to report in January 1944 to Washington. We applied for work in Office of Strategic Services. From there, he went south to Orlando, Florida, U.S. Army Center for Training in Air Intelligence. It was a new field of instruction since previous military intelligence study had been broad-based and designed mostly for infantry and engineering personnel. Their instruction included evasion techniques, a class Jack himself could have taught. He was enjoying his deeper look into how America waged war from away from the battlefield. He moved next to Miami Beach, where he received Army Counterintelligence Corps training and again had conversations with members of the OSS, whose operations eventually evolved into the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947. So vast was the military operation in Miami that more than 300 hotels and apartments were leased to house more than 80,000 personnel and some of their spouses.
was Jack treated well there? And then
Yeah, it spoke to Jack's status that he and Bonnie were housed at the swank 18-story Lord Tarleton Hotel, Miami Beach's first high-rise building. She reveled in the fact that they were staying at one of the best hotels on the beach. Um, and enjoyed sunning on the beach in the swimsuit she knew she wouldn't fit for too much longer. She was expecting a baby in December.
okay, and that's going to be their first child. What's his name going to be?
Randy.
Randy. Okay, so um, does Jack get some kind of glamorous billet or what? What happens?
So all the glam and fame and OSS special treatment wears off. The Army Air Force comes to call him, and they forget about what he's done for them. You're gonna go to and they need to train new pilots on new planes. And so Says the army assignment wasn't a reflection of kind-heartedness toward a man who had survived the ordeal of more than 2 months behind enemy lines. The strategic bombing missions in which Jack had participated were by this time mostly targeting Germany, reducing the need for a French-speaking U.S. operative behind enemy lines. An assignment stateside also prevented him from being shot down a second time, this time captured, in which case he might reveal secrets of the resistance. In addition, his experience in the field could be valuable in teaching a new crop of American airmen, who cost an estimated $50,000 each to train and equip, not to mention months to become combat ready. So Jack unhappily ended up at Peyote, Texas, instructing men flying B-29 Superfortresses headed for the Pacific, where
Mhm.
Americans were in the process of liberating Stepstone Islands to create a path to Japan. The remote West Texas field's nickname was a Rattlesnake Air Base, spoke volumes about the airman view of the place.
Well, West Texas is infested by rattlesnakes. If you're going to live out there, get yourself some boots that go up to the knee. That's no exaggeration. That's true even today.
Yep.
Should be so. He was a devout Catholic. He had his wife there. He showed he's faithful to his wife, even on the beach. And so, those aren't good values to get you promoted in the OSS. We've talked here about how people got promoted into the OSS who were nothings. Rockefeller was a nobody in the army, and they gave him control of a whole town in Germany,
Mm-hmm.
and he had no training to do it whatsoever. But since he was in with the guys, he got shot right up. But
Yeah.
Jack, devout, faithful, practicing Catholic, goes to mass every day. No, we'll ship you out to West Texas in a rattlesnake-infested base. you know, this
Yeah.
is class. This is how the Masonic Lodge runs America and runs American corporations. If you are a Catholic and wonder why your non-Catholic friends get promoted and you don't, this is the reason why.
Yeah. So, but Ed had bigger concerns in city politics. Jack had far more on his mind than training B-29 pilots. He wrote his father as time neared for Bonnie to give birth. Soon the family will be one head larger. It still is sometimes difficult for me to realize that fact, Jack wrote. I guess it must be rather overwhelming for you, times two. Guess I was just a kid to you only yesterday. Had I known in those days what I know now, I'm sure I would have been far less troubled to you and mother. Bonnie sent a telegram to Jack in Texas on December 12th. Better leave on the 17th. I want you to be home from hospital when you arrive. Big event might be this weekend. Feeling fine, don't worry, Bonnie. I could see Jack like
But Jack has a really good attitude. He sees the birth of his first son as like a rite of passage. He's now no longer a boy, he's a man, and he's going to
Mhm.
be a father. So, very healthy, normal outlook on life, not like what
Yeah.
is promoted today. So he leaves
Um,
he leaves the army then.
so their son arrived December 17th in Minneapolis. Jack and Bonnie discussed names for a time at the hospital, but when he left the room, she settled on Randy while listening to a bedside radio to the Randy Merriman's Overseas Special, a variety of series for servicemen that featured music and interviews with celebrities. Jack was on the phone with George and Bonnie made the decision. Patrick A. George wrote after the phone call, not knowing it had changed. A good name. One of Bonnie's relatives named Randy had a son named Jack. He was known as Randy's Jack, and the baby became Randy Jack Ryan. The Ryan side of the family approved as well, since one of Ed's cousins claimed patriarch Patrick Ryan's friends had called him Randy. Jack was able to see his new son only through the hospital nursery window, for he had to return to Peyote. While he was a happy father, he was a morose serviceman. He was still stinging from the Army's decision to send him to the air base in Texas rather than back into the cockpit of the B-17, or even better, into intelligence work. Bonnie bore the brunt of his poor disposition in spite of the occasion of their new baby. George scolded him after word reached him. When things start getting you down in that whole beauty, don't take it out on Bonnie. He wrote, you had her so worried about you, and the wonderful thing you two have that she nearly goes crazy trying to figure out ways to calm you down. At some point, Jack lashed out at her, mentioned his attraction to Paulette Desmond, who had helped him get out of France. And you did. You said she was a beautiful girl. He's part.
Those are words you don't say to your wife ever.
His French side came out.
These are words you don't say to your wife. Hey, all you young men out there, don't ever say those words to your wife in any tone of voice.
Yeah.
Don't even think them.
And Bonnie rips him a new one. I've heard quite a bit about this girl in France, for whom you had and may still have a big charge. But however the feeling there is, why in Christ did you ever have to mention her to Bonnie? George wrote. Jack, you've got a perfect gal. Jack also was feeling pressure to begin making plans for his wife and infant son, now that the war's end was nearing. He would follow Ed's course in defining the role of father. Providing for his family might not be the only definition of fatherhood, but it would come first in the pecking order.
So this is how Jack's the war ends, and Jack gets out of the military, and we're going to follow his career and its bumps and downs. Some unusual events that if they didn't happen, he wouldn't end up what he is. But
Excuse me. So the war ends. He's out of the army. He's working for General Mills in Minneapolis. And in 1947, there was a blaze at the entire General Mills facility with damages exceeding $3 million, and that left him without work. He was like,
yeah, so General Mills in Minneapolis does um, warehousing of grain. It's a big grain collection and processing point, flour production, milling of grain, and well, the place where you work at burns out. It's a pretty clear sign that God wants you on another path.
so he wasn't thinking in law enforcement, because, well, the fire hasn't happened yet. It happened. He's like, that's it. I'm following in my father's footsteps. He applies to the FBI and gets accepted.
Okay, so
And he's like, I'm sort of the black sheep of the family because it took me so long to get into police work, Jack said. He had grown a mustache that had to be shaved off before heading off to training in Quantico, Virginia, where Ed also had trained while attending the FBI Academy in Washington in 1942.
what was his experience like in the FBI immediately after the war?
Um, it's a funny thing. It goes into a lot of what Ed was doing, but nothing about Jack.
Mm-hmm.
So, but after he gets all trained and sworn in and everything, one of Hoover's G-men was preparing to leave Minneapolis. Jack had been assigned to Richmond, Virginia as a special agent, and his commitment to career overweighed any hesitation to uproot his family. Two generations of Ryans outweigh three generations of Ryans. John, Ed, and Jack created the father-son narrative of lessons learned. Ed had been everything his father wasn't, but Jack would be everything his father was: ambitious, hardworking, and duty-bound. Jack and Bonnie loaded up the family Ford coupe, pulled away one morning, a makeshift bed in the back window for 4-year-old Randy. They would never live in Minneapolis again as a family.
Okay, so that was like 1950 or 1949. They headed out. But to own a car in 49, you were already doing pretty well. Um, I remember the stories of my own family, of my grandmother pulling her savings together to buy a car in 52. That's so she could uh, go to work. And because my grandfather always went to work on foot. So, uh,
So he gets to Richmond. Jack would have viewed the Cold War in 1950 through a different lens than an American would today. Communist North Korea invaded and nearly overran South Korea in June, where the United States joined the fight with support from the United Nations. So he believed the FBI was the perfect place to be as he embraced his father's fight against communism, as well as his allegiance to J. Edgar Hoover. He quickly became accustomed to the pull of the Bureau. One of his first assignments was to conduct a background check, but an executive at the company where the man worked told him that the personal records were private. Jack used a phone at the employer's office to call the FBI supervisor, who told him to sit and wait. The executive came out a short time later and said, "Mr. Ryan, come with me." He showed Jack into his office, opened the file on his desk, and left, saying as he closed the door, "If there's anything I can do to help you, let me know." Jack asked why the change in attitude. The executive disclosed that a call had been placed to the company's founder in New York.
yeah, I wonder what kind of connection that was. So, Hoover was complete. What people didn't know back then is Hoover was totally corrupt. I think Hoover was dressed in drag, and he was a pedophile, and he was really, really strange. And someone who's happily married, normal, practicing, believing Catholic wouldn't last long in the FBI. Did Jack start noticing things were awry in the FBI even back then?
Yeah. Uh, you don't want to go into the Virginian driving tests?
Oh, you want to do that? Okay, we can talk about that first if you want.
So,
So, what is AJ? You took a driving test more recently than I did. What was it like? And now we're going to talk about what it was in Virginia in 1950.
so you still had to do the written test, then you had to do the driving test, where you literally got in the car and drove with the person
Instructor. Hmm.
instructor. Well, says Rink had his privileges in personal matters as well. Jack headed off to get a Virginia driver's license one work day, planning to return quickly. He passed the written exam, an examiner rejected him to a practice test involving toy cars on a road drawn on a table. Jack was maneuvering the cars when he was called to one of the office phones. "What the hell are you doing?" asked his FBI supervisor, who then hung up after learning of the toy car exam. Jack returned to the table, but before he finished the test, a clerk approached. "Ryan, here's your license," he said.
I don't know if Jack even said it or thought it, but when he saw these toy cars, he probably said, "You sure you don't want to give a license to Randy, my son?"
And everyone who's ever took the written test, the driver test, that your license is mailed to you.
Yeah, that's true. It was even my day. It was license. I got my license because the test driver who was in the car with me didn't want to get into the car with me a second time. I drive very well now, though, but
Yeah.
so
So then after that, you would soon need to take the Michigan driver's test. But they don't go into that detail because he was transferred to Detroit in 1950 and a year later to Lansing. It was a key area for the FBI in its investigation of communist subversion because of Detroit's big three automakers, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, and their hundreds of employees, hundreds of thousands of union employees.
Mhm.
And so we moved to Detroit and Lansing. Bonnie and Randy were, adjusting to life in the FBI very well. And they had play dates and including with the Michigan and the governor of Michigan's own children who lived down the street from Jack.
Oh, yeah. And they're in Lansing. But Jack decides that he needs a life more suited for his family, doesn't he?
Yeah. So um when he's doing that, he's just mm, uh just going through everything that he's seen, heard, and just wrote his brother George. Like the bureau files are replete with data showing how these bastards worked out a clever overall plan to sink us from within by infiltration and propaganda, Jack wrote to George. We extremely naive Americans almost fell for it.
Well, that's what he thought. We did fall for it because they came through the Democratic Party.
Yeah, so Randy was in Michigan in the spring of 1953 when he was taken to a doctor to check a cyst under the arm. An exam found a bacillus that couldn't be identified, and with the tuberculosis outbreak underway nationwide, he was placed in a hospital quarantine. He ended up spending the rest of his third grade year in a hospital ward with other quarantined children, some of whom died while he was there. Jack and Bonnie were able to come in, but his cousins remained behind the glass barrier when they visited. While he was hospitalized, Randy learned that his father was leaving the FBI to take a job as an assistant professor of the police administration at Michigan State College in East Lansing.
Okay, so that's what gets him to settle down in Lansing.
Yep.
Which in our next episode, you'll start wondering if that was just random or was this all being organized by
Yeah.
some other person, because this opens his road to Vietnam. So thank you, AJ, for having me on this fourth episode of the life of Jack Ryan, Catholic hero, and how he gets involved in intelligence work,
Yep.
and how he gets kind of sidelined because he was Catholic.
Yep. So this automatic TV signing off. As well.
Yes, well.